Dear Professor Tamar, dear Professor Batikaiva, dear colleagues, dear students, I'm happy to speak to you today about the concept of will in Christianity, or better said, on the concepts of will in the history and philosophical context of Christianity. Not only in modern day philosophy, but already in the cultural and philosophical context of biblical writings and church history, the concept of will is used in quite ambiguous manners. It is especially challenging to distinguish the concepts of freedom, free will, and will, as they are often used interchangeably. The term is attributed to humans and to God, but usually not univocally. Attributed to creatures, the term will can refer to either desire, intentional behavior, or even rational and/or free choice. In this presentation, I want to scrutinize the concept of will and its development within Christianity, with a special focus on the historical discussion in early antiquity about the nature of the human will, and in late antiquity on the relationship between the divine and human will in Christ. I will give a quick overview over the long-lasting dispute between intellectualism and voluntarism, which is mainly a debate on the relationship between intellect and will. Finally, I will reflect on the Christian concept of the will based on contemporary philosophical discussions. If one aims to understand how the concept of will is used in Christian tradition, it is important to take a close look at both the influence of Greek philosophy and of the Jewish biblical context to the formation of this concept. The recently deceased German philologian Albrecht Dürer has done important work comparing the biblical and the Greek usage of the term will in antiquity, and came to the significant conclusion that there is no term in early Greek philosophy that corresponds to the biblical Hebrew concept. It was in the long process of interaction between these two traditions, especially in early Christian theology, that a new concept of will evolved, which brought together important anthropological intuitions from both traditions. Let us first turn toward Dürer's thesis. What is the difference between the biblical and the Greek concept according to him? The biblical account of will is the ability or predisposition of a human that enables him to answer God's invitation or call, independent of his or her intellectual faculties. We can talk here about strong voluntarist or voluntaristic tendencies. For Greek philosophy, especially Stoicism, obedience to God was not a matter of choice, but of intellectual insight. Knowledge in this intellectualist tradition results in free assent to what is thoroughly understood. True freedom consists in doing what is reasonable. According to Dürer, the Greek intellectualist concept of will and the biblical voluntarist concept of will are not only fundamentally different, but none of the two traditions even possessed an accurate term for the concept of the other tradition. The minor voluntarist tendencies in early Platonism, here, for example, the term talmao was used as a, you could say, a morally significant overcoming of cowardice, did not have a strong influence for Greek philosophy in general. Where biblical ideas were discussed in Greek, usually based on the Septuaginta translation, the concept of will thus lost its voluntarist meaning, or was in some way integrated into the Greek understanding. Because the origin of Christian theology is formed by Hellenistic Jewish thinking and Greek philosophy, it is no surprise that the Christian tradition started off with a strongly intellectualist concept of will and maintained this concept until medieval times in many traditions and schools of thought, even until today. The mainstream of Greek philosophy presumed a two-part psychology. In the human mind, there is supposed to be a rational will on the one hand, and an irrational will coming from desires and natural drives on the other hand. Sometimes the irrational will takes over, which we experience as weakness of will. The Apostle Paul refers to this in his famous passage in the Epistle to the Romans. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. But in fact, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. Paul associates the will coming from desires, which is not always under his rational control, with sin. This does not mean that all natural desires are sinful, but definitely some are. In Christian tradition, original sin was, as a result, often associated with a disposition to sin, which lies in our natural drives, mainly concupiscence in all of its varieties. Greek philosophy in late antiquity was more and more aware, also because of Christian influence probably, that the original Greek concept of will cannot account for moral responsibility. In a purely intellectualist concept, one is either not responsible because of weakness of will, or because of a flawed rationality, but never because of a morally wrong choice. But already in early antiquity, the question of morality was brought up. In the 5th century BC, the concept of economic will was invented, which will more than a millennium later, in the 7th century AD, have a significant impact on the development of Christian theology. Gnome designated not only the right understanding, but the actual agency according to the right understanding. So, important distinction. This concept thus unifies intellect and intention. Moreover, it was discussed whether there are emotional influences besides natural desires which impair one's intellect and, as a consequence, one's decision-making process. From our perspective, we'd say clearly there are, such as anger, distrust, or sloth. However, in the early times, all these emotional influences were regarded as negatively impairing reason, and this without any voluntary control. However, as Thiele has observed, there is one major exception. That's menos, pure willpower. As he sees it, menos comes very close to the concept of will in modernity, because it does not designate the decision-making process or the result of this process, but the initial energy for agency. Thiele shows that moral accountability in early Greek philosophy, but actually even more in poetry and drama than in philosophy, is often associated with a culpable lack of willpower. Thus, there is not a two-part, but actually a three-part psychology: reason, desires and emotions, and agency. However, because of the increasingly stronger belief in a natural order of all things in Greek philosophy, as well in Platonism, in Stoicism, and in Epicureanism, the two-part intellectualist tradition prevailed, at least for a while. Most church fathers and theologians of the first centuries of Christianity were strongly influenced by Greek philosophy, including the Greek concept of the will. This is why also the voluntarism in the New Testament was often misunderstood or misinterpreted. Thiele shows that the Apostle Paul's concept of the will was in clear continuation of Old Testament thinking. Paul might have been a Roman citizen and aware of Greek philosophy, but he adopted the explicit voluntarism from the tradition of his people. However, the Greek language, as outlined, lacked the terminology to make this voluntarism explicit. It was actually a Jewish philosopher who died shortly before Paul started preaching and writing, who helped form a Greek voluntaristic concept of the will. Paul, however, has not known of Philon of Alexandria's philosophy. Philon argued that God's will is absolutely free, and so is man's power to answer to God. Philon introduced the conscience as a third category besides reason and emotion, and he called the ability to decide solely based on one's conscience protomia. This term usually means an inclination of the will or readiness of the mind. However, this idea remained somewhat incoherent, since Philon often emphasized that turning towards God is itself an act of God's grace. As it is the case regarding ideas in Paul, much later, the Lutheran Catholic controversy about whether faith results solely from grace or also out of free choice was already grounded here. When we take a closer look at Hellenistic Christian theologians in the 2nd and 3rd century, such as Irenaeus of Lyon, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria or Origen, we find that they all have strong intellectualist tendencies. They associate humans' will always with reason. Although one was fighting against Gnostic, as well as Stoic and Epicurean determinism, one was still strongly embedded in Platonic thinking. But with Neoplatonism, there came a major change into Greek philosophy, possibly again slightly inspired by Judeo-Christian voluntarism. Suddenly, it was conceivable that the will is ontologically prior to the intellect, both in the constitution of the one, of which all emerges, but also in every reasonable creature. Porphyry, who died 305 AD, argued that the human soul can actively turn toward levels of being beneath itself, act against its own nature, against reason. Salvation for Porphyry is helping the soul reorient itself toward the intellectual sphere. Now, although Porphyry was a harsh critic of Christianity, Augustine and many other Christian theologians admired his thinking. Augustine is widely known as the major figure that grounded the voluntarist concept of will in Christianity, overcoming the confusing Greek terminology and introducing the Latin concept voluntas to refer to man's power to decide independent of the intellect. However, Augustine also adopted the idea of original sin and fallen human nature, implying that the human will was only free in its unfallen state and will be again after redeemed by God's grace. What exactly is the relation between will and intellect, according to Augustine? Put very short, man has control over his cognitive faculties. He can turn his cognitive faculty towards or away from an object before the cognition occurs. Even more, this act of will is independent not only of the intellect, but also of emotions. This is true also about the will to turn towards God, that is the answer to his call, which is, according to Augustine, independent and prior to all discursive thinking. So we're back into a three-part psychology. The debate on the concept of will was, as in Augustine, focused on the relationship between God's will and the will of human creatures. But starting in the 5th century, after the Council of Chalcedon, the discussion was more and more shifted towards the relationship between the divine and human will in Christ. After the council, the Alexandrian school became more and more dominating, resulting in a one-sided compromise between the schools, stating that Christ only had one divine energy, our will. That's monothelitism and monergism. The Council of Constantinople in 680-81 rejected both doctrines, claiming that Christ had two wills, one divine and one human. They are intertwined in such a way that the human will necessarily subordinates to the divine will. The Greek way of saying that is dei hypotagenai. And the dei is the it had to. It's a very strong term designating a necessity. The doctrine of diotheletism, which was confirmed at the council, states that there are two natural wills in him and two natural operations, undivided, inconvertible, inseparable, unmixed. But what concept of will is used when one thinks that two wills can be united in this special way in one person? Most theologians interpret Constantinople III as claiming that Christ had a human will of the flesh and a will to do what God wills, but was not free in a libertarian sense regarding his second order will to let the divine will prevail over the will of the flesh. If one overviews the history of theology regarding the relationship between Christ's human and divine will, one finds that Christ was not attributed a power to choose between opposites, especially not the power to act against God's will. But still, he had a human will. Up to today, most theologians concur with Maximus Confessor's view, which highly influenced the official diothelite doctrine. Christ was fully human, including a creaturely free will, but without having a power to choose evil. Such a statement is only possible if one accepts a compatibilist view of free will, that is, that having free will does not entail the power to choose between opposites. Guido Bausenhardt has thoroughly analyzed the concept of will used by Maximus Confessor. The important term here is autoxosiotes, the power to determine oneself. Exousia is the instance that dominates the capacity to will, actualizes and manifests it. It is to be distinguished from prohairesis, the rational decision, and even more from telema physikon, the will that belongs to the nature of an entity. However, although Maximus attributes autoxosiotes to Christ due to his human nature, he rejects attributing to him a so-called canonic will, the power to choose between morally significant options, the power to sin. Usually, these two terms coincide, as Bausenhardt notes, but not in Christ. Why is this? According to the Antiochian tradition, Christ's will is a divinized human will, while the human will of ordinary humans is a will actualized under the conditions of a fallen human nature. Thus, the power to sin is, according to Maximus, not essential to human nature, but only to fallen human nature. What can be learned from these discussions is that the Christian concept of the will is not a libertarian one. However, it stands in a quite complicated and nuanced relationship to such a concept. Before looking into this relationship from a systematic point of view, I'd like to make a quick excursus to the related discussions in scholasticism. Thomas Aquinas defended a strongly intellectualist position. As Colleen McCluskey writes, quote, Aquinas argues that choice is a function of the will in light of a judgment by the intellect. In other words, the will moves the agent towards a particular action, an action that has been determined by the intellect. Quote end. If we do not have power over our beliefs and the functioning of our intellect, we thus have no power over our actions. Duns Scotus argued exactly in this manner against Aquinas. If the intellect, as Scotus thought, is determined by the environment, and Aquinas were correct, the will would not be free. Scotus rejects Aquinas' intellectualism, sharing Bernard of Clairvault's view that the will is, quote, not determined by the judgment of the intellect. It's not a coincidence that this tradition was heavily influenced by Augustine. For Scotus, free choice is about deciding to act according to the intellect or according to passions or natural desires. An idea most philosophers attribute to Immanuel Kant, but was already present in Scotus and the voluntarist tradition in the late medieval age. Voluntarism was often rejected because of what Leibniz later called the principle of sufficient reason. It was simply unacceptable for many thinkers to regard the will as inexplicable and mysterious. To quote McCluskey again, Scotus loses a rational grounding for understanding why an agent acts as she does. But maybe this is just the price to pay for advancing a theory of free will. There can eventually be no reason for our decision, only the fundamental choice of an agent. What should become clear from analyzing the historical discussions, not only in Christianity, is that we need to clearly distinguish the concept of will as a certain psychological inclination and the power to, as a certain psychological inclination and the power to choose, which is often termed free will. If a person finds herself in a situation, as Kant coined it, to choose between inclination and obligation, there are two forces at play. A will that inclines us to follow natural instincts or passions, and a will that inclines us to do what is rational. Even intellectualists assume that sometimes the first will trumps the second, which already Socrates called the phenomenon of weakness of will. The rational will is sometimes weaker than the natural will. Moderate voluntarists agree that this assessment, however, they believe that there is also a higher order will that can either be directed towards the intellect or the desires. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt introduced the terminology on higher order willing, although he himself, as a compatibilist, denied that we have any power over our second order wishes. Nevertheless, this terminology can be quite helpful even for theological discussions on the nature of the will. Christian voluntarism emphasizes that we do have very little, but some power to choose our second order wishes. The most basic higher order wish is the wish to act according to the intellect and not according to one's desires, a fundamental decision for reason. This decision, of course, is only theoretical, since it is only partially actualized one way or another in different circumstances. So no person has made a decision for reason or for inclination 100%. One has to distinguish between different levels of voluntarism. A person might be free to choose between different options presented by the intellect, and or she might be free to choose to let her actions be guided by the desire or the intellect, even if there's only one rational choice. If one only defends the first category, one runs into an infinite regress. The choice between severally, equally, or incommensurably rational options must also be a choice guided by reason. Thus, the second option is without alternative, a choice between reason and a rational inclination. There is, moreover, a third level of willing strongly emphasized in Christian tradition, especially in Christian ethics. Started already with Aquinas' teaching of virtues and vices. A virtue is a habit, likewise an inclination, which is partially under our voluntary control. We might be born and brought up with bad habits. However, we have the power to slowly change these habits, at least with some external support. Vices are not identical with natural inclinations, but they're culturally and individually created instances which form a third level of willing in the human psyche. If a drug addict wills to continue using, this will dominates all of his actions, most of the time overwhelming not only his rational will, but unfortunately way too often even his natural wills, including self-preservation. If, on the contrary, a devout religious person, or possibly also a humanistic person, who has irreversibly formed his character towards the good, sees a person that needs help, she does not make a decision. She rather automatically acts according to her character. The obtained will to do the good trumps not only the natural will, but even more the power to choose. Only this way can we defend the idea that human beings are essentially free but impeccable in their eschatological state. We cannot sin in heaven. This is only possible because our second order will can be transformed to become an impeccable will that always chooses reason before desire. According to traditional Christian anti-Pelagian doctrine, this character formation is only possible with the help of God's grace and not by our own power. According to the Thomist Eleanor Stump, we can only choose to fight against this transforming grace or let this grace do the transformation in us. She calls this positive option the quiescence of the will. Here, a lot more can be said, but for the sake of time, I will stop at this point. I hope I could give you a quick overview of the concept of the will in Christian theology and its cultural and philosophical contexts from antiquity up to today. We saw that a thinker's or tradition's anthropology is closely related to what concept of the will is defended and in what relation different concepts of will are believed to stand in. I would be happy to discuss with different philosophical and religious traditions what kind of will is regarded to be essential to human nature. I'm also aware that there are structurally very similar discussions in Judaism and Islam as the Christian discussion between voluntarism and intellectualism, both concerning the human will and the divine will. I purposely omitted speaking in detail about God's will in this presentation because this would have required a whole lecture on the question of God's nature, God's personhood, and freedom beforehand. Nevertheless, I'm convinced we already have sufficient topics to discuss. Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you all for listening.